All right, hello everybody. Welcome back to CHRTC 309. All right, so in this lecture, we're going to talk about kind of millennials and their religious beliefs, specifically taking from Smith and this time his earlier co-author, Melinda Lundquist Denton, um, and their notion that what the real lived religion of millennials is something that they call moralistic therapeutic deism or MTD. But basically, we'll go through, kind of what Smith and Denton sort of conclude about millennial religiosity for the most part, and kind of what this says about their religious lives in general. Okay, so the concept of moralistic therapeutic deism actually comes out of one of the first books that was written coming out of the National Study of Youth and Religion, which I talked about already when I talked about the millennials. So I won't rehash it. Just to say again, this is this project that ran from the early 2000s to about 2015, and collected lots of survey and in-person interview data about the religious lives of teenagers, right? So this comes specifically out of a, a book called Soul Searching, The Religious and Spiritual Lives of American Teenagers, which was the first book published off the project. And it was done, with Melinda Lundquist Denton, who was Christian Smith's grad student at the time. And Smith is the head of kind of the project and one of the top researchers in the world on sociology of religion. Okay, so in the book, basically what they argue is that, despite, maybe the notion that America is a Christian nation and therefore most young people must in fact be Christian, that the actual lived religion, like not ideologically, but lived, of most American youth isn't Christianity, but instead something that they call moralistic therapeutic deism. Smith and Denton suggest that there are 5 core beliefs that moralistic therapeutic deists hold. The first one is that a God exists, and this God, orders the world and created the world and created the universe, and is basically there to watch over human life on Earth. What does this God want? He wants people to be good and nice and fair to each other, as taught in the Bible and most other world religions. And this is a really important point because it's very broad, right, in its application. Be good and nice, and that it's a kind of unifying vision that, whether you're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, Sikh, Buddhist, Baha'i, whatever it happens to be, you should more or less be able to get behind this idea that what the supreme being, whatever you call it, wants is for you to be good and nice, right? And that this is something that's shared broadly by most world religions. What's the purpose of life at number 3? Well, the purpose of life is to be happy and to feel good about yourself, right? That it is, a very therapeutic kind of religion, one that is, and that's where the therapeutic and moralistic therapeutic deism comes, right? But the central goal, like what is the purpose of life, was to be happy and to feel good about yourself, right? And this probably owes as much to Freud as it does to anybody, but it has that very, very therapeutic kind of feel to it. 4, God, he's there, but he doesn't need to be particularly involved in your life. You don't really need to pray to him or to, worship him or whatever, but basically he's there when you need him to resolve a problem. And so Smith and Denton basically suggest that the God of moralistic therapeutic deism is something of a cross between a cosmic butler and a divine genie, right? Very much there to serve, what you want. When you need him, he shows up, and the rest of the time he kind of butts out. So that God is not particularly present, right? Not particularly important, except when you need him to solve your problems. And number 5, that good people go to heaven when they die. And this is, I think, a really interesting point because it's one that seems to be, fairly broadly shared amongst adults and teenagers. Good people go to heaven when they die. Who is a good person? Well, the definitions vary, but from what you can gather from the interview data that's part of the project, almost everybody is a good person, right? You have to more or less devolve to the level of, Hitler, Stalin, or Mussolini, or serial killers like Jeffrey Dahmer, in order to not be a good person. It's really interesting because as part of the interview data, and one of the people who shows up in all three waves is a guy named John. And, John is, I think the proper term is a little bit of a repulsive individual. He talks openly with the interviewers about, how many women he's had sex with, how many girls he's cheated on, the fact that he's stolen from his girlfriends. That he's gotten into fist fights with his father in Las Vegas, after they lost a bunch of money at the poker tables. And yet John, really interestingly, is convinced that he's a really good person and that, he's in good standing and he gets to go to heaven when he dies. And I think, among other things, this shows the capacity of people to kind of explain away their own flaws when they have to. And how inclusive the notion of being a good person and getting to go to heaven when you die actually is, right? That at the end of the day, this is a very inclusive standard, and it's meant to be, right? Because it's meant so that you never have to condemn anyone, and in a sense, never really have to worry about the ultimate kind of spiritual destiny of anyone regardless of their belief system or their kind of moral standing. But these are, basically those 5 core beliefs of moralistic therapeutic deism. So I've got a little video here for you to watch on. It comes out of a documentary called Soul Searching, same title as the book, featuring some interviews with Christian Smith and with Melinda Lundquist Denton, just about the project and about their findings.
The majority of American teenagers, I think, are moralistic therapeutic deists, not Catholic, not Presbyterian, not Jewish. The God of moralistic therapeutic deism, I say in the book, is something like a combination of a divine butler and cosmic therapist. He takes care of your problems, he helps you to work out your difficulties, and doesn't get too personally involved in the meanwhile. Moralistic therapeutic deism basically believes, sure, a God exists, it's theistic, God created the world, God orders the world morally, people should be nice and fair and friendly, that the purpose of life is to be happy, to be satisfied, that's what it's really about, that God doesn't need to be very involved in one's life, God can sort of be off at a distance, hence the deism, except when one gets into trouble or has problems or needs something solved, then one can call on God and God will sort of hop to it. And teens have an immense amount of faith that God solves their problems. He fixes their troubles and he makes life work better. He makes them happier. Religious traditions are, from my perspective, are really being colonized and corroded from the inside out by moralistic therapeutic deism. And that is, as a sociologist, I am skeptical of what is going to be the fiber or the theological content or the intellectual substance of beliefs and practices of people a generation hence. It seems to me that many social forces are basically converging to sort of watered down religious faith of all different sorts, so that you no longer have distinctively Catholic and Jewish and Muslim and Wesleyan or whatever. You just have this sort of bland mush of be nice, call on God when you need him. And that is not what these religious traditions really believe. I've come to think that in our culture, increasingly, the language of faith is like a second language. It's like Spanish or French or German. It's not a primary language that people learn and speak. And we know about second languages that you don't just pick it up by osmosis. You need to be around people that speak it. You need to be instructed in it. You need to have practice talking in it. And I think one of the things that was clear in what we found is that very few adolescents are having much practice learning to speak their second language of.
It's important to note that Smith and Denton will say that nobody really uses the term moralistic therapeutic deism or moralistic therapeutic deist, unless, of course, you've taken a class with me. I've had a few students sort of come out of a couple of classes with me suggesting that they are probably moralistic therapeutic deists. But most people, right, this is a kind of foreign term, and it's not something that the teenagers were saying. Rather, this is a term that Smith and Denton used to summarize the attitudes of teenagers about God and religion. Okay, so we're going to break down the kind of 3 aspects of moralistic therapeutic deism. So how it's moralistic, how it's therapeutic, and how it's deistic. And then that should give us a clear sense of what it means to be a moralistic therapeutic deist. Okay, so what is moralistic therapeutic deism? How is it moralistic? Well, it's about inculcating a moralistic approach to life. So what does that mean? Basically, a certain kind of standard of moral behavior against which you can measure, whether you are a good person or not. Okay, so it believes that, central to living a good and happy life is being a good moral person. And this is the kind of goal. What does it mean to be a good moral person? Well, it means being nice, being kind, being pleasant, being respectful, being responsible, working on self-improvement, which I think is a really interesting one, right? Because it has an almost self-helpy kind of vibe to it. Like, what does God want you to do? Well, he wants you to rock that bikini body, or make the most of yourself, get, great grades in school, get your Chris Hemsworth kind of abs, take care of your health, right? To be a healthy person, right? You go jogging, right? You work out, and doing your best to be successful. So it has this weird kind of capitalist bent to it too, right? It's about living your best life now, which is where, you potentially see it interacting with, prosperity gospel preaching in the form of guys like Joel Osteen, right? Where, Joel Osteen's a preacher out of a mega church in Houston, and he's written books like Your Best Self Now. So, I mean, this is, in a sense, moralistic therapeutic deism's approach, right? It's self-care, it's self-help, it's, self-improvement, it's maybe mindfulness meditation, and that's sort of at the core. It's also about being the kind of person that other people will like, right? Fulfilling your personal potential, not being socially disruptive or obnoxious. And, one of the nice things I see in the books where Christian Smith will describe this is that he says, in a lot of ways, it's about don't be an asshole. Pardon for the crude language, but this is how people put it, right? What does God want? Well, he wants you to not be an asshole. This is over and over again in the interviews, right? That this is the kind of moral standard that people see as to what God wants from them. So what does Christian Smith say? Well, this is a moral vision that's basically super inclusive, right? Anybody from any faith, or even people who are agnostic or atheists, can sort of be pulled in under this umbrella of the moralistic life. It's a really kind of, I think, low standard, and it's a very, self-helpy one, I think, in a lot of ways. All right. So that's the moralistic aspect. The next aspect, of course, is the therapeutic one, which we'll talk about on the next slide, but it's really about feeling good about yourself. And, in this kind of view, feeling good about yourself is an essential aspect to living a moral life, right? That you have to be, kind of self-fulfilled in order to have that kind of moral life. Because in a sense, not feeling self-fulfilled goes against that moralistic outlook in moralistic therapeutic deism. So moralistic therapeutic deism is also about providing therapeutic benefits to its adherents. And this is right from the book. It's a quote. I don't have the page number there, but it's right from the book. And this is what Smith basically says. It's not a religion of repentance from sin, right? That's not kind of key. It's not about keeping the Sabbath or living as the servant of the divine or saying your prayers or observing holy days or of building character through suffering, which is a really important part of, particularly Jewish and Christian faiths, and Islam as well. Building your character through suffering, of basking in God's love and grace, right? And accepting what God's done for you. And of, basically in gratitude for what God's done for you, going out and spending your life or your energy on social justice, on care for the poor. All of these things that we would traditionally think of as religious behavior, that's not what MTD is about. What is it actually about? It's about feeling good, happy, secure, and at peace. And basically, it's about subjective well-being, getting along with people, resolving problems. And to the extent that Christianity or any other religion is able to help people do that, then it's fulfilling its therapeutic purpose. But it's not about kind of what I think Christianity or Islam or Judaism would traditionally have been about, which is, serving God or worshiping God, or living in some way consistent with some grander design. It's very much, about you, about me, about how I feel. And so it is religion in service of making me feel good. And I mean, this has been something that I think we've known for a long time, that, American Christianity in particular, starting in really the 1960s, started to move in this direction of being much more therapeutic. Now, that may be a function of, that competitive religious marketplace, that as people started to want that more, well, the Christianity that emerges from that kind of market demand model will provide that kind of a service. So, I mean, here you can potentially see that model that Stark and Fink, propose in the Churching of America, getting twisted, and basically making a faith in moralistic therapeutic deism that is, somewhat watered down, because that's what people want, right? Give the people what they want. Well, this apparently is the faith that a lot of people want, which is probably why a lot of religious institutions provide precisely that kind of faith, because it's about making me feel good about myself and pretty much nothing else. And NTD is deistic, but not in the traditional sense, right? So basically, traditional deism, if you look at the kind of 19th century definition of deism, and what, someone like Thomas Jefferson broadly would have believed, 18th and 19th century, kind of definitions of deism, it's a God that is, created the universe and then sort of walked away, and we haven't heard from God in a while, but he's not involved in the world anymore. It was just, something created and then, walked away. And this isn't precisely the kind of God that moralistic therapeutic deism presupposes. It presupposes a kind of modified version of deism, according to Christian Smith. So the kind of God, created the world, defines the general moral order, but doesn't get involved, right? Especially, in those parts of people's lives that they would not like God to be involved. So, really puts no moral claim on people in terms of wealth, in terms of care for the poor, in terms of sexuality, anything that might make people feel uncomfortable, say, with their lifestyle choices, is certainly not something that God is going to make any kind of, moral claim to. Most of the time, this God keeps his safe distance, So the teenagers would say, he's watching over from above, controlling everything, but not really getting involved. He can get involved, right? God is, like Smith said, kind of a combination of that cosmic butler and divine genie, can pop in to help resolve some problem, some bad feeling they want resolved. And I remember, a friend of mine, who certainly wasn't, I think, a person of very consistent faith, but sort of started praying when he thought he might have gotten his girlfriend pregnant, and didn't want that outcome, of course. And suddenly, kind of looking for God to jump in and resolve that particular problem. And this is sort of the idea behind moralistic therapeutic deism. Deism here, right? So it's revised from that 18th and 19th century model with the therapeutic qualifier, right? So God is distant except when you want him to be present, and then he kind of swoops in. And I think probably one of the most picayune kind of phrases that comes out of Smith's work on this is he says that this God is not demanding, and he can't be, because his job is actually to solve our problems and make us feel good about ourselves. And therefore, this God can't make sort of moral demands, because that's not the kind of job of God in moralistic therapeutic deism. God is there to help you fix your problems, not to tell you what to do. So what Smith and Denton will say is that this is not a religion that stands alone, right? It's not something that you pick up and practice. It's not like, you look up moralistic therapeutic deism and suddenly you know what it is and you're like, well, now I'm a moralistic therapeutic deism. Generally what they say is that moralistic therapeutic deism sort of has worked its way into other already established faiths, and sort of ended up becoming sort of parasitic, right? So basically, it sort of worms its way into, an already existing faith, and then sort of starts to feed on and twist and mutate the theological substance of those traditions into its own kind of distorted image. So what he thinks you get out of this is not, people who are moralistic therapeutic deists, but people who are, Christian moralistic therapeutic deists, or Jewish moralistic therapeutic deists, Mormon moralistic therapeutic deists, or even non-religious moralistic therapeutic deists. So that basically, it turns whatever kind of ideological and religious system people are into this sort of system. And basically, in a lot of ways flattens out pretty much all religious differences that are important in a society like the US or in Canada, so that everybody more or less starts to believe the same thing with the, maybe here you add or, to be Christian, you add or subtract, Jesus, to be Catholic moralistic therapeutic deism, maybe you add, going to communion and confessing your sins. Although I suspect that moralistic therapeutic deists are not all that keen on confessing their sins, because, that would be God making a sort of moral demand upon you. Subtract, the Christian story and put in the Muslim story or the Mormon story, and you're still getting, a kind of moralistic therapeutic deist vision. And so what Smith and Denton say is that, a good part of Christianity in the United States is at best tenuously connected to the actual Christian tradition. And instead, it's really morphed into what he calls, and I love Smith because he turns a phrase so nicely. He's much less pugilistic than Rodney Stark is, but I feel like he turns better phrases, right? The cosmic butler and divine genie. And here, he says that, a rather substantial portion of American Christianity has morphed into Christianity's misbegotten step cousin, Christian moralistic therapeutic deism. Now, for Smith and Denton, this isn't a repudiation of their parents' beliefs either. He suggests that this is the view present in most teenagers, but that most teenagers and parents, when they were surveyed as part of Wave 1 of the National Study of Youth and Religion, didn't indicate really that they were, sort of shifting away from the beliefs that they were taught, but rather, in a really deep sense, this was a continuation of their parents' beliefs, that this is what they had been educated in morally and religiously, that this was the kind of view that their parents had. They're not rejecting their parents' beliefs, and their parents don't feel like they are rejecting their parents' beliefs. They feel like, basically this is in continuity. So, at the end of the day, this seems to reflect the contours, priorities, expectations, and structures of American Christianity in general at the adult level, right? That this is what's happened, in a sense, since the 1960s and the turn towards the therapeutic, or what Philip Rieff, who's a great interpreter of Freud, calls the triumph of the therapeutic. That religion, in a sense, and maybe because, if you want to put it in, either Berger or Luckman's terms, is really now competing against things like self-help, things like New Age, things that are principally aimed at, making people feel better about themselves. And so what happens is it transforms into that kind of self-help philosophy to, I guess, meet the demands of the market, if you want to put it in Stark's terms. And so it's not a rejection, though. This is not like teenagers being like, I need to modify the faith of my parents to be more in line with, I don't know, the sort of, more kind of socially tolerant beliefs that have come with the rise of, say, the LGBTQ movement or, the feminist movement or whatever it happens to be, but that this is actually quite in continuity with the beliefs of their parents.
Another person who worked on the National Study of Youth and Religion is Kenda Cressy-Dean. So Kenda Cressy-Dean is a professor at Princeton Theological Seminary and a youth pastor in Princeton, New Jersey. And so her role in the National Study of Youth and Religion was, she was one of the people that went out and conducted the interviews on the young people that were interviewed as part of the project. Okay, so basically, because of this, she got to use some of the data, and she writes this book called Almost Christian: What the Faith of Our Teenagers is Telling the American church. Really interesting book. Highly recommended if you want to have a different understanding, more from a Christian perspective, what some of this data means, less from a social science perspective and more from the perspective of someone who deals with young people all the time. Okay, but one of the things that she kind of touches on in the book that I think is really interesting is she suggests that moralistic therapeutic deism serves an adaptive purpose in American society, which means, it's there for a reason, right? It's helping people with some social problem that they otherwise were having trouble dealing with. So, she says that one person told her that, MTD is the way the church survives in American society, basically through that therapeutic aspect. It allows people to be happy enough, right? And it gives religion a sort of social purpose in helping people to feel happy enough. It also treats God as a tool, right? It's instrumental, so God becomes one tool in the kind of toolbox to make people feel good, and particularly in a pluralistic consumer society where they have a lot of choices. So in a sense, God becomes, no more than almost like a bottle of Prozac, right? It's part of a potential set of tools that people can use to feel better about themselves and to feel happy in their lives. And what she says too is that, in this increasingly pluralistic consumeristic culture, one where people are increasingly dealing with, people who have different faiths, MTD is useful because basically it kind of levels out a lot of the differences and makes it seem like everybody more or less believes the same thing, right? So she gives the kind of example of her daughter, and she was driving her daughter and her daughter's friend, who happens to be Hindu, around, and they were discussing religion, and the way Dean tells the story is that basically they're like, okay, well, you believe in these gods and I believe in God, but we basically believe the same thing. Now, from a theological perspective, that couldn't be less true, but this is what MTD does, right? By kind of moving to the most common the lowest common denominator in terms of what religions teach, it allows everybody to sort of get along. And so I love this phrase, right? Like Smith, I think Kenda Chrissy Dean has done a good job of turning a phrase here and saying that, social survival in this culture requires turning down that heat on Jesus, and other confessional particularities. So any particular like Catholic, Protestant, Jewish disputes that people in the past might have tended to focus on disappear under the sort of reign of the sameness of MTD, right? So you turn down the heat of Jesus and on like Catholics are better than other Christians, or Catholics aren't Christian kind of rhetoric, which you hear a lot, or you used to anyway. And when you turn that down, what you highlight is, the benefits of religion that help people feel more safe and less anxious. And that's what she thinks MTD does.